So what is the impact when the bat populations decline by 98%? What impacts is that going to have on other things, pest, insect species? Or there has to be some impact. So we're part of a big effort. That was part of the reason why I got started doing a bat project in Rhode Island, is to answer some of the basic questions. What bat species occur in Rhode Island? Where are they located? What are the important habitats? And anytime you're going to be capturing animals or studying animals, you have to know their behaviors. So even somebody who's trapping animals for their fur spends a lot of time studying their behaviors. You have to know what type of habitats you're going to find these animals in. What are they using? What are their behaviors? Same thing with small mammals. If I'm going to trap for northern water shrews, I'm going to look in specific habitats, to try and capture them. So there's active capture techniques where you're physically capturing an animal in a cage trap or a body gripping trap. And there's passive monitoring, like Paul said, with the today trail cameras, a commonly used technique for surveying, just doing basic surveys, presence, absence surveys. Or with bats, we use acoustic monitoring. So we have bat detectors. I didn't bring one, but during the summertime, you could go out here at night in this field with a bat detector, and you could listen to bats. Yeah. The species of bats that are most affected are bats that use caves, primarily for hibernacula. So we basically divide bats into two groups. There's tree bats and cave bats. So those bats, like little brown bats, that use caves for hibernacula. Hibernaculum is a place where bats go to hibernate, spend the winter. Behaviorally, those little brown bats tend to cluster. So you might go into a cave or a mine where bats hibernate, and you'll find thousands of bats in very tight groups. That's the strategy they use to survive the winter. Other species of bats, tree bats, like red bats and silver-haired bats, hoary bats, which we have, they're all summer residents here in Rhode Island. They migrate south, typically, like birds, in the same way generally birds do. They move to the southeastern United States or even further south. And they may or may not hibernate when they get there. They may be active year-round. But those species of bats that use caves or mines, primarily for hibernacula, have been the ones that are most affected. And little brown bat, along with northern long-eared bats, Indiana bat, which is already on the federal endangered species list, those have been most impacted. So they're at higher risk just because of their behavior. Now, what's been determined, has been a lot of research into, what is this? Identifying the fungus. It was newly described to science in 2007 or 2008 when researchers started working on this. Determined it was a fungus. They have since determined that it probably originated in Europe. There is a similar fungus that occurs there, and it co-occurs with bat species there. However, bats there seem to exist with this fungus in the cave. The fungus only survives in the caves and mines in those cold, relatively humid environments there, so it won't survive out in the open or in attics or other places that bats might use at other points during their life history. So it stays in there. So the theory is now that at some point, somehow, the fungus was transported to North America. In the same way, a lot of diseases were introduced into this country, human, like smallpox and other things that native peoples here had no immunity to. It's a very similar type of thing. So bats here that evolved in North America had no resistance to this fungus. So what the fungus does is it disturbs their metabolism. Bats go into hibernation, they fatten up for the winter, they feed, they develop fat reserves that basically are going to provide the fuel for them to survive the winter. So somehow the fungus disrupts their metabolism, they become dehydrated, they burn their fuel reserves. The bats will wake up halfway through the winter, December, January, on a day like today. They're hungry, they're thirsty, they exit the cave, and basically they freeze to death or eaten by predators or whatever. So that's basically what we understand about the fungus now and how it's impacting bats. So there's still a lot of research going on, and almost every month there's a new press release that's been discovered in a new state or a new county in a different state. So, and it's continuing to spread, so there's a lot of concerns. And right now, northern long-eared bats, which we have here in Rhode Island, are on a track for listing as a federal endangered species, primarily due to impacts from the fungus. So I brought a bunch of show and tell stuff. I've got small mammals. I brought a few pelts and things, some information. There's some handouts on the back table regarding trapping. Like I said, I'll get Paul those 2 PowerPoint presentations that he can make available to you, one about bats and the other about regulated trapping. Does anybody have any questions specifically about traps or more questions about bats, anything about mammals that I might be able to answer for you today? The most common species of bat in Rhode Island is a big brown bat. Okay, that bat I would consider ubiquitous, pretty much found throughout the state. They're a year-round resident here in Rhode Island, so they typically, in the summertime, big brown bats as well as little brown bats segregate themselves by gender. So female bats will congregate in maternity colonies. So you may have as many as 300 or more bats. All females will congregate typically in a man-made structure, like a barn, an attic of a house. So all the females congregate typically in May or June, but usually in May. They'll get together in these maternity colonies, and they'll have their babies together, and all as a group. So those bats, probably within 4 to 6 weeks, those young bats can fly. So typically by August 1st, the young bats are capable of flight. Shortly thereafter, they abandon the maternity colony and go off into the landscape, roost in trees, other structures. Not here in the Northeast. Down south, you have bat species that use caves not only as hibernation site, but as maternity colonies as well. But here in the Northeast, where it's a little cooler, they seek out really hot, dry environments. And they have a hard time. They're a small mammal. They need to regulate their body temperature, and typically young bats, especially when the mothers leave to go and feed for the night, they have a hard time regulating their body temperature. So they'll go in these attics where it's 110 degrees. You and I would die in those kind of places, but they're able to tolerate that. And it helps with raising the young grow quicker, and again, they're not chilled. So big brown bats are most common bat species. You can find them anywhere. Any athletic field you could go to at dusk, the bat you're going to see flying around is probably a big brown bat. They're very tolerant of human activity. They're on this property. They feed in this field, but like I said, they use man-made structures like other species won't. Yeah. It's a challenge. Yeah, it's a challenge, and bats are one of those types of animals that people kind of get icky about, like bats, spiders, snakes, not on the charismatic fauna list. It's a challenge. We have regulations regarding people who do, we call them nuisance wildlife control operators, or in some states problem animal control person, but we license individuals or companies to assist private property owners with various nuisance wildlife issues. So we try and educate them about bat life history. When's a good time to do exclusion? If you have bats in your attic, obviously there's health reasons why you may not want 300 bats living in your attic of your house. But there's appropriate times to deal with that issue and appropriate ways to deal with that issue. Too many times you hear horror stories, people going out with the caulking gun and the hammer and nails and, we'll keep the bat, seal the bats, they ended up sealing the bats in the house and stuff. So there's an appropriate way and timing to do that. And, the best way we can approach that is through educating homeowners, property owners who may have bats, but also those people that help them. So, yes. That I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if anybody's looking at that. Right now, it's like panic mode. What do we do to protect our bat species? And I don't know if there's any other research ongoing that this fungus may have other applications or uses. I really don't know the answer to that. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure at some point, once we get past the emergency of, what do we do about our, to save our bats, that at some point, there, maybe somebody would take it to that level and look at if there's benefits. I don't really know. Yeah, it's so new to science that people probably haven't even given that any consideration. Yes. To humans, there's no evidence to suggest that there's any health risk for people at this point. So it just affects the bats, and it only affects them during the hibernation period when they're actually very vulnerable. So bats go into hibernation, they basically shut down their metabolism, and their immune system kind of shuts down. This is a behavioral trait that they've evolved, and up until this point, it's worked very well. It's worked great. But then you throw something different in the mix, and as you know, with evolution, it doesn't, they cannot respond that quickly. So I would guess, 25 years from now, 50 years from now, you'll start to see recovery of bats. There'll always be some, I'm sure, that will survive. That 5% or 10% that lives, they have something genetically or whatever in them that allows them to survive. The problem is with bats is, unlike all these other little small mammals here, which are typically characteristic of them is they have high reproductive rates. A mouse or a chipmunk, they can have several litters a year, a number of years. So bats have a different reproductive strategy. They have one baby per year, and they have a really high mortality rate in their first year. But that's worked for them for a long time. For eons, that strategy has worked. Young bats have a really high mortality rate their first year. Maybe more than 50% of them don't survive to their first birthday. Those that do tend to live 30 years.